Miss Hildegard Nagel, our next speaker, is almost a charter member. You missed it by a few months, did you, Hildegard?
I thought I was put down on the list in some way, but I certainly wasn't.
Well, we accept you anyhow. She tells me that she studied at the Johns Hopkins Psychiatric School of Social Work and worked at the Phipps Psychiatric Clinic in Baltimore for some years when Dr. Adolf Meyer was its head. Hildegard Nagel, too, began working for the club soon after joining it, first as vice president and program chairman and on the committee of Jungiana. She has been on the publications board almost since its inception and chaired it for a few years. One of her outstanding contributions to the publications board, by which the library has likewise benefited, has been as a translator, a field in which she is particularly gifted and indeed has joined the ranks of the professionals. Hildegard had 2 terms as president from 1956 to 1960. She is currently a member of the Library Advisory Committee and is still on publications. I take great pleasure now in introducing Hildegard Nagel, who will give us some memories and evaluations.
Let's see if I can get oriented. Can you hear me when I'm here like this? Well, I feel as if I'm going to repeat a lot of things you've heard already. But I think those 2 papers and comments have given you some idea of the sober, responsible thinking of the analysts and the almost rambunctious enthusiasm of the analysants, which together shaped and inspired the club. It took both to make the club possible at all and to give birth to all the activities we've come to take for granted. I wasn't, as you've heard, one of the starters of the club. I began analysis too late. And when the club started, the work was being done by many thoughtful people who had consulted together for some time. In any case, I shouldn't have had much to offer in the real work of the club, organizing activities, mapping out a constitution, planning budgets, keeping accounts, or even helping to decide how analyzed people should behave as a group. Well, inevitably, I'm going to talk about things I was connected with that I naturally was interested in. And the few names I'm going to drop as I pass are not chosen for any reason except that they came across the things that I was in myself. I hope you'll make allowances for this one-sidedness. And remember, a great many people here would tell you very different highlights than I'm going to. But I want to suggest that one-sidedness can be valuable. For instance, as Alice Dunn has pointed out, I happen to be able to read German. Well, at the time that I came in the club, there was another war about to start, and ever since World War I, German was looked down on a bit. But it suddenly turned out to be terribly important because that was what Jung was writing in. And so, if any of you have one gift you think isn't maybe popular or something, you might just see whether it couldn't be used. Well, my first introduction to the club entity was during Dr. Jung's Bailey Island seminar. It was perhaps the most overwhelming introduction most prospective members ever get. Usually one's introduced decorously and after due preparation at a formal club meeting, while I, knowing scarcely anyone, was suddenly plunged for a week or so among an island full of presumably analyzed people whom I confess I looked at with a mixture of awe and mistrust. I sometimes wondered whether I really belonged to this miscellaneous group or even wanted to. My only real moment of revulsion was, however, in seeing a whole portfolio of unconscious paintings spread on a porch. I sort of blinked at that. But by the time I left and had experienced the inestimable privilege of hearing Dr. Jung day after day, had taken part in friendly conversations, and even functioned as a waitress at the final party, I felt both accepted and acceptant, and was very happy to belong. By the next fall, regular meetings were established. There were, of course, lectures by our analysts, which then as now provided a main reason for having a club at all. What they've given us all these years is absolutely astounding, but that's too long a record to go into. Later, with the help of the expanding California clubs, as you've heard, we were able to bring people over from Europe. I think Rivka Scherf, now Mrs. Kluger, was the first to give us a full seminar. Later came Dr. von France, Miss Hannah, Dr. Meyer Orr from Zurich, then Dr. Fordham from London in 1960, but that's very recent history, Dr. Adler. We also, the program experimented with speakers from other fields. Some of them clicked with us, some of them didn't. And when they didn't, I think it was because we didn't know how to relate to them or they to us. I hope we're getting some practice in that. Then we had evenings of entertainment, of really, especially in the beginning, then we used to have skits and little plays. And I remember especially one where the young woman, I don't know whether she's here tonight or not, anyway, who acted this part, she was going to Europe the next day, and she went up to a telephone and called up a famous analyst and said she would like to be analyzed before she left. Never forgotten that. Then we had, we had a very successful program, I think, called the Feast of Lights. Just telling you this because we've had some very good programs again, and since then, but this was fully costumed, and a succession of scenes. As far as I remember, the meaning of light in Jewish, Christian, Egyptian, and American Indian legend. And then, of course, the Christmas parties started very early with first the chorus that used to help us first give songs and then sustain our voices or our ears or whatever we needed to have sustained, and was all very nice. Now, the Bulletin didn't start till 1939. And when I was trying to find the history, I missed everything that happened before that. There was only a newsletter which told when programs were coming and who'd been elected officers, and mostly like that. But the Bulletin, like almost everything the club has done, was inaugurated because people wanted to have it. They wanted to communicate. They had thoughts, or they wanted to tell you about shows or books that were good. And so, because of this demand, the Bulletin was given a green light to go ahead. And it started just very much the way it is now, only it was shorter. The accounts of meetings weren't so full. And I think it was decided quite some time ago they ought to be as long as they are, because some people can't come, and then the associate members don't get anything else except the Bulletin, so they ought to get something worthwhile. Well, now, the Bulletin, old Bulletins is really such fun that I think the newer members ought to, if they ever have a chance at the library, to look at them. In the first years, the club was full of itself, and the Bulletin contained lively discussions of its nature and purposes. What were we? What could we do? The threat and impact of war, all the problems of the world, somehow got translated into the problems of us as individuals in an organization called the club. Were we a democratic organization? Or was there a totalitarian trend? Did we have enough freedom as individual members? I was still pretty much on the sidelines myself. I never quite understood what that was all about. Was the implication that we were ruled by a hierarchy of analysts? At that point, it seemed to me it might be just as well. Since then, I've gathered that in some cases at least, the executive committee was felt to be the frustrating factor. Of course, that perennial focus of projections was doing its best, faced with new problems and the awful responsibility of establishing precedents. Along with other collective problems, the Jewish problem suddenly faced Jew and non-Jew alike, and both Jew and Gentile sent in some very thoughtful contributions on the need to see people as individuals and to be seen as an individual oneself, all quite appropriate to our present and every other race problem. In the meantime, we had poetry numbers with the offer of more poems than there was space for. Everybody was raring to go in those days. Our entrance into the war brought a leaner period to the Bulletin, partly because people were otherwise occupied, but also because of the scarcity and cost of paper. I think since that war is over, Bulletin has gone on a very even keel and been something to be proud of. But looking back on those old numbers, I can't help thinking that something would be added if now and then someone stuck a neck out to ask a foolish question or express an offbeat point of view. Of course, the Bulletin is no longer for members only, as it used to be. So perhaps, I won't say dirty linen, but unironed linen is no longer in order. The club publications were started with a similar yes, we can attitude. There'd been a few club papers before, beginning with Dr. Jung's New York Mandala lecture. And both the Bulletin and whatever papers were published were issued by what was called the Publications Committee. And early in 1941, the Publications Committee, with Ellen Thayer as chairman and Elizabeth, Sergeant, as a very enthusiastic member, persuaded the Executive Committee and the Advisory Board, as the Medical Committee was then called, to sanction the issuing of a club annual, which after some hassling, the hassling hasn't stopped, was called Spring. The main idea was to print club papers, but Elizabeth Sergeant, who'd spent some time in Zurich, felt we could get articles from there. As a matter of fact, Dr. Jung very kindly sent us a manuscript in German as a gesture of encouragement. It arrived the day our material was to go to the printer. Fortunately or unfortunately, I discovered before going further that this was one of the few papers that had already appeared in English in the integration of the personality. It was quite awkward to know what to do. Stanley Dell, the editor and translator of the other papers, informed us that this article had been sent him in English, ostensibly written by Jung himself. So our first issue of Spring began with a rejection slip to Dr. Jung. Now, that's really something. Luckily, he forgave us. From the second issue of Spring in 42 to that of 57, there was only one number that did not contain an unofficial translated article by Dr. Jung, and that one contained a summary of his paper on the Mass. By 1957, the Bollingen Foundation began preparing the definitive edition of Jung's works, and our efforts to make a part of them available were no longer needed. But as you know, Jane Pratt, editor of Spring for most of its life, obtained Dr. Jung's permission to publish the visions, which have been appearing since 1960. But even without Dr. Jung, the 1941 issue was anything but provincial. It contained articles by Tony Wolff, Violet de Laszlo, just over from England, Heinrich Zimmer, and Mrs. Jung's classic paper on the animus. Now, that's a good beginning, wasn't it? To finish thoroughly, can you hear me? I keep wiggling or swaying. To finish with our early publications, in 1943, we found the chairman of the Publications Committee was really heading two committees. Spring was a full-time job. the two committees were separated into the Bulletin Committee and the Publications Board. Now, the plans for this Publications Board were very carefully drawn up. Till quite recently, it always contained at least one analyst to advise on psychological points. Dr. Bertin served on it for many years until the beginning of her last illness. Her interest was very strong from the outset. I remember a small meeting when the plans for the new board were being shaped up, and she exclaimed, "The club has grown up." As you see, the war did much to stimulate both Bulletin and Publications. It did even more towards starting the library. Not that a library wasn't wanted, people talked about it all the time, but the expense seemed too great, and in those early days, gifts of money, though not, of course, of hours of work, were frowned on as undemocratic. You know, things change. In January 1940, a series of letters to the Bulletin finally led to an experiment. A small group called the Library Group was authorized by the Executive Committee to organize on a subscription basis. The dues were 25 cents for 4 weeks, or $1.25 for 4 months. That was all the time it lasted. From the proceeds, he rented a small basement room every Friday night at the Architectural League, where most club meetings are being held. The room contained a locker which not only held the books members were willing to lend, but also publications to be sold at meetings. When in the May of that year, the business meeting, it was voted the library should be the responsibility of the whole club. This was very appropriate because the club had been lent a complete set of Dr. Jung's Zurich seminars. I think your president told them something of this in the last May. As the Bulletin announcement put it, emphasizes the need of a library for the use of the whole membership. One problem was that the reading of these seminars had, from their first printing, been prohibited to anyone who had not attended them. Of course, that would mean there'd be practically no one living who could read them anymore by now. Fortunately for everyone, permission was obtained by cable from Dr. Jung to allow all club members to read them. Well, all the rest of most of the story of the library, which is, of course, a great achievement, probably the best achievement for posterity the club has accomplished, was told you last spring. But what I want to bring home to you at this point is the really international importance that a collection of Jung's works seemed to have at that moment. At the time the library was voted into being, the Germans had swept into about all of Europe, northwestern Europe, they'd ever succeeded in occupying. Shortly afterward, Italy entered the war. Were all the lights going out? Was even neutral Switzerland safe? Jung's works, we heard, were on the Nazi index, and even if they were not publicly burned, they might all be inadvertently bombed. So far, we'd only collected or borrowed English translations of Jung, at that time very incomplete, especially as Jung was turning out writings fast. Now it seemed vital to preserve all the originals for the sake of future readers in every language. Our club was then the only Jungian organization in America. We felt a very deep responsibility. We owe the swiftness with which this job was attacked to the push of Gertrude Ingersoll, who started the whole idea and was made the chairman of a Jungiana committee, which by gift or purchase gathered books from all directions and made the contacts with Jung's publishers, which still hold. This committee was in close connection with the library and also with the new Publications Board, which had the benefit of an immediate view of new accessions to choose from. It was a very exciting time. The war stimulated the programs, too, partly, of course, as someone's paper said, by the thoughtful papers given by our own analysts, but also by those given by new arrivals from Europe. Among these analysts were Dr. Laszlo, who had had a paper in spring which she really delivered here, Dr. Henderson, who'd been in England and now stayed in New York 2 years before settling in San Francisco, as did Dr. Kirsch before going to Los Angeles. Dr. Abel and Dr. Engel stayed with us. The list of those who likewise had their start in Europe and joined us later is longer perhaps than we usually realize, and their share in club history is very large, but I'm recounting the older memories now. The first comers gave us new insights from the standpoint of their individual and direct experience of the conflict abroad. However, for me, the most memorable contribution was given us a decade later by Miss Amiller, who had stuck out the war analyzing in Berlin. You will find it in spring 1950, of course not available except by reading in the library, spring 1950 under the title of Jungian Psychology in Wartime Germany. 2 other Europeans added to the interest and excitement of our meetings. The first to arrive was Dr. Friedrich Spiegelberg, a specialist in Hindu philosophy and literature and religious history in general. Besides speaking at club meetings, he gave seminars to smaller groups at people's houses. Just the other day, I found among my mementos an announcement of a series of 8 lectures on the psychological meaning of Christian dogma. He also possessed a very sensitive and sophisticated appreciation of every form of art. I remember especially a conducted tour of an exhibition of Paul Klee. Now, this has nothing to do with the club. This is the only thing I remember of his lecture, although it was so cute. It seems that after Klee painted one of those mysterious and humorous and everything other pictures, which there are always such wonderful titles to, he didn't make them up himself. He got the whole family together, and they had a family, a parlor game choosing the name for the picture. Wouldn't you wish to have been there when it'd been fun? About a year later came Dr. Heinrich Zimmer, who had lost his professorship at Heidelberg because he was married to a partly Jewish wife. His achievements are well known, largely due to Joseph Campbell's faithful editing, but his effect on those who heard him I can best give by quoting what I reported to the club myself after hearing him at the Eranos Conference in 1938. The subject was the Great Mother. Dr. Zimmer, I said, in speaking of the Great Mother in Hindu mythology, condensed into a short hour and a half a suggestion of the infinite variety and richness of the Hindu conception. Dr. Heinrich Zimmer is a very great lecturer, a marvelous artist in words. To hear him is like listening to music or watching Shankar dance. Many of you are too young to have seen Shankar dance, and I'd forgotten about it till I reread my own words, but he too could transport you into an alien and magical world. This may sound like exaggerations or transference on my part, but after Dr. Zimmer arrived in New York, my enthusiasm came to be generally shared, and I'm sure all the older members are still grateful for the privilege of having so often heard that exciting and stimulating genius during those 3 brief seasons before he died. Now, there's a small adventure of my own, which I'm presuming to tell here, though it's perfectly personal, because it related to Eranos and to the archetypal pictures which Mrs. Frobe Captain, the organizer and hostess of the early conference, had begun to collect, and which really formed the start, the nucleus, of the vast collection Jessie Fraser has been working with for so long, and which supplied the material for Institute lectures this month. But chiefly, I want to tell you about it because it illustrates the experimental, hand-to-mouth nature of our early projects. Ellen Thayer and I decided to go to that conference for various reasons. And it was learned here, and I think Dr. Harding told me about it, I hadn't known it before, that there was going to be a large collection of photographs of Great Mother, statues, everything else, going back 1,000 years, and many more than that. I mean, I don't know how long. And Dr. Harding suggested first, and the executive committee said we should try to buy a few copies for Mrs. Ferber Captain, bring them back for the benefit of the club. Well, at the close of the conference, we broached this request, and Mrs. Ferber Captain very generously offered to lend us the whole set. That meant 349 large photographs packed in a very ancient suitcase. Well, her place, Casa Aranos, is on the shore of the lake, and as far as I remember, maybe Ellen will correct me, we had walked down to the hotel with the hope of getting a taxi when we left. But it turned out that taxis at that point in 1938 could not be ordered there. The only way to get a taxi was to go to the Ascona Wharf. Well, we were on the water, and you could get a rowboat, so we got into a rather ancient-looking boat, which was propelled by two very rough and ready-looking men, and the lake was rather wavy. And I paddled a canoe in rougher water than that, but I never dreaded side swells quite as much as sort of with this valuable cargo and it's sort of going this way. Well, we got there, and the rest of the journey to New York, taxis, trains, ocean liner, was simple enough till we reached the New Jersey dock. Well, I'm glad that Miss Eleanor Linton's paper and so on has given you some idea of how, sort of taboo everything Jungian was at that point. Otherwise, you could hardly believe this story now. I've got this upside down. Here we were met by the customs officers, something we've been too naive to foresee as a problem. After all, these pictures were not new and were borrowed only temporarily. And my main terror was that some of these great mothers' pictures would seem obscene to any conscientious inspector, and that the club might be accused of underground moral subversion. However, we managed to keep the discussion down to the problem of import duty. Were they to be used for educational purposes? Oh, yes. To be publicly exhibited? No. We were much too new an organization to be public, at least to my mind. Well, then they couldn't be brought in free. We were let off the duty of $20, which seemed much bigger in 1938 than would now. So we got them in, and the next problem was how to show them to the club. Well, at that time, the club was very new, and I think the analysts are perfectly wonderful. They knew exactly who could do what, apparently, and in no time at all. I think we only had about, a month, but that was end of the summer and people coming home, and they managed to get the right people for every job there was to do. Now, the Depression hadn't been stopped by the war yet, at least not here, and there was a large vacant room at the Commonwealth Fund where two members, Gerda Smith and Ellen, in the Fuller building where the Commonwealth Fund was, these two members somehow spotted a very large vacant room, which, as far as I remember, we rented for 2 weeks for $40. I may be wrong about that. The total cost of the exhibit, anyway, was given in the annual report as $70, and I think that included the $20 I was repaid. And then there was a catalog which sold for 35 cents, 349 items. That was a rather difficult, short-time project, and here's where various analysts came in. Mrs. Wicks, for instance, must have suggested Martha Dickinson, who was then a student of art history. And Marguerite Bloch, I don't know, everyone knew about her. She was in charge of the enormous file of religious art at the Low Memorial Library. So that helped getting information about these pictures, because there was practically none on them. And then, of course, the pictures were hung on the walls by club members. I do remember Henrietta as being very helpful, but the person I remember most is Gladys Taylor. Club members and 70 by guests, so it really wasn't held so awfully private. 7 members planned and arranged it, 10 helped prepare the catalog, and 29 acted as hostesses. And when the last day of the exhibition, Dr. Harding presented the club her paper on the mother archetype and its function in life, which illumined the whole subject for us all. Well, I'm almost finished, but there's another branch of club activities that are really, which other people started with and which I could have started with, because that is the study groups. I mean, in a way, the study groups started the club. They were meeting even before it was founded. Their experience helped to show the values of a more inclusive organization. The education group, which is still a going concern, was launched the night after the dinner where Dr. Bertine gave the paper that was read to you tonight. And then at the first annual meeting, which was 2 years later, in 1937, there were reports from 5 study groups: education, religion and philosophy, dance, choral, and Bible. There have been others, short-lived but productive while they lasted. I can speak directly only of the religion and philosophy group. Its program has always consisted of a paper by one of its members. That means about every other year for each of us. For a while, we worked very hard, choosing a theme for the year, such as fire, the descent into hell, and so on. Some of these papers have been read at club meetings and or appeared in spring. I've always been a little rueful that the footnote in spring telling whether, about it, didn't include first read at the R&P. It really would make me feel good. Recently, our papers have tended to be based more on personal experience and are perhaps directed more to ourselves as a group. But the group still means a great deal to us. We never miss a meeting if we can help it. The education group has lasted even longer. I think it has devoted itself primarily to the study and discussion of Jung's work. I wish someone would write the history of its 33 years. I think one of the hopeful things about the club life now is the fact that new groups are being formed. Their effect has, I think, already been seen in the Bulletin and maybe club meetings. In these smaller groups, we get the stimulus to pursue our own thing in the company of others and try to connect it with the announced purpose of our club, the study and discussion of analytical psychology. The other purpose is fellowship, and fellowship is more than friendliness, it is working together. Many of you, most of you probably, have felt the reward of serving on the hard-working committees, and I suppose no one feels like a full member who has not taken her or his turn. This very essential fellowship, however, can be experienced in any worthwhile endeavor. The study groups offer a fellowship specific to Jungians, and I can heartily recommend them. I've tried to express some of the excitement of the early years. Of course, a great deal I haven't said, and other people could tell you. I'm very happy to feel that the same things that I think started the club, sober, responsible thinking, and almost rambunctious enthusiasm, will continue to work together.
Well, listening to this gave me the feeling that Hildegard must have sent out sparks that will reach some of us for the present and the future, perhaps. It all sounds as though it had been an exciting time. I hope those of you who have joined recently got this feeling too. Hildegard suggested that instead of questions, a few of you might like to make comments or say something from your own experience.
I mean, is there something that something happened to anybody that they really wish ought to have been included, for instance? Because this was a one-sided presentation. I mean, I should love to have talked about the first time I went to a group, for instance, and that was the Bible group that Eleanor Stone was running. I mean, I haven't anything to say except it was such fun to go. But if I kept on saying things like that, I'd be here till 11. What's happening with that?
Yes, Gladys?
I remember a meeting that happened at the very beginning when there was a great discussion about the Constitution and whether there should be requirements for membership. And some people argued that if you're Democratic, you let anybody in, that you didn't have any requirements or any limitations. And others argued that democratically you could set the requirements.
That sounds so typical of just what went on.
Anybody else? Eleanor?
I think I'd like to draw attention to the fact that Elizabeth Sargent and Margaret Flanagan were two of the people that started the getting together. Margaret Flanagan had a discussion group that lots of us belonged to. Did
You want to turn around?
I don't know, but I think all the other people ought to hear you, Eleanor.
Yes, that's better. I didn't realize I was sitting with quite so much of a proportion of people behind me. I was saying that two people contributed the simple thing that helped to be the kind of background for the club. Margaret Flanagan had a discussion group. It was a very, Margaret Flanagan, as any of you who know her know, is one of the most highly intelligent and rational human beings that ever walked the earth. She's got a superb mind. But Marion Cowan, if she's here, will possibly remember that she and I met on the way to one of the evenings. And we looked at each other and said, did you understand the last discussion? And we both had dreams. I am a thinking sensation introvert, and I dreamed I was hung up by my hair and couldn't touch the ground. And Marion, who's an intuitive, dreamed that she couldn't find any elevator that went high enough to get her there. But those two groups, and then Elizabeth Sargent, who had, as you know, a tremendous gift for human relationships, had a group which was very informal. And because it was Elizabeth that had more men in it, she knew how somehow or other to think with them and work with them in the way that some of us didn't know until perhaps we began to learn a little. However, those two groups were forerunners of the club. Because that was the time that people came together and discovered that it was very live and very satisfying to meet together and talk together about from the Jungian point of view.
Thank you, Eleanor, and I'm so glad you mentioned Margaret Flanagan, because she just a couple of days ago sent us a kind of history of the club that she and Eva Lewis worked on. Eva Lewis Smith? Eva Lewis Smith, thanks. And I haven't had time to read it all, but we'll certainly have it in the library, and maybe excerpts will be published.
I asked her over the telephone the other night whether she was going to be able to come down tonight, and she said, "Oh, mercy, no."
Too bad.
She might as well live on the moon, as far as I can discover, for any
I can
practical
imagine.
getting
I can imagine.
Helen McKay?
I just want to pay a tribute to Margaret Murdoch and the work she did with the music.
Yes.
Yes. Well, any other comments? Or I hope you all enjoyed this evening as much as I did. That's all I can say.